All right, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon in some areas of the world. My name is Josh Valentine. I am the Outreach Communications Manager for the Clean Coalition. The Clean Coalition is putting on this webinar right now on our Transmission Access Charges, or TAC, campaign, uh, entitled CAISO is Avoiding a Fix to a Massive Market Distortion That Harms Local Renewables and California Ratepayers. The webinar will be presented by Katie Ramsey. She is a staff attorney at the Clean Coalition and one of the essential team members heading up the TAC campaign. A couple of logistical things I'd like to take care of before we get started to Katie's presentation. If you need to go or if you need to drop off early, just be assured that the webinar recording and the slides will be sent to you via an email in a couple of days. Will be hosted on our YouTube channel and on our website. If you have a question, we're going to be having a Q&A session at the end of Katie's presentation. You can type it into the question box to the right in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can also use the chat function, but we prefer that you use the question box to the right there. And we'll pick out some of your questions and hope to get to all of them, but we might be pressed for time at that point, but we'll do our very best. If you have a question, technical or otherwise, about the TAC campaign or the Clean Coalition, you can contact us at info@clean-coalition.org. And again, if you do have a question, answer them into the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So right now, let's get right to it. We're going to pass off to Katie Ramsey, and she is going to be presenting.
Great, thank you, Josh. So let me just take a minute to start my presentation. All right, so here's what we're going to go through today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Clean Coalition's mission, our goal is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and develop a modern grid through technical, policy, and project development expertise. And we work to ensure that the more electricity from new generation facilities in the United States comes from local renewable energy sources. And so one of the primary obstacles that we found to creating that local energy reality in California stems from the way that transmission costs are measured and allocated. So the transmission access charges, or TAC campaign, is geared towards correcting the measurements and cost allocation to make sure that utilities that are using the transmission grid pay in proportion to their use. So in other words, we want to make sure that usage pays. So this is how we're going to discuss this matter today. We're going to go through an overview and how the Clean Coalition is proposing to solve the problem, and go through who benefits from the solution, why there's a sense of urgency to resolve this issue before CAISO expansion, and to go through the steps that have happened in the CAISO stakeholder initiatives to date. And then we'll end with next steps and how you can get involved. So the first slide I want to talk about is wholesale distributed generation. This is the market segment that the Clean Coalition works with most closely. And we see this market segment as critical to making the transition to high penetrations of renewables possible. These resources have a unique value to ratepayers and utilities because they generate clean energy very close to where the customer load is. So with wholesale DG, resources like rooftop solar can generate electricity on the same distribution grid as load. So this is helpful because it frees up capacity on the transmission grid, and it meets energy demand without requiring additional investment in transmission infrastructure. So these resources provide a very unique and special value to other customers and to the grid, and we want to make sure that that value is captured in the way that the costs are allocated to these resources. And so that brought us to thinking about how the value can be recognized and incorporated into procurement decisions. And the biggest impact the biggest challenge that we see to these resources is the expected growth in transmission access charges. So transmission access charges are per kilowatt hour charges that a utility pays for use of the transmission system. And these costs are then passed on to ratepayers through their transmission and delivery costs in their energy bill. And right now, those costs in PG&E territory, as an example, are about 1.7 cents per kilowatt hour. The issue is that we expect those TAC rates to grow very quickly over the course of the next 20 years, and there's two reasons why that's going to happen. The first is that as peak load demand grows, so does the need to build additional transmission infrastructure to meet that demand. So some portion of this TAC rate growth is going to come from the natural growth in energy demand in California. The other main driver of this expected growth in TAC rate is coming from the need to bring additional renewables online. So California set a 50% renewable portfolio standard that needs to be met by 2050. So in order to bring those renewables online, CAISO and utilities are expected to invest in transmission infrastructure to be able to bring energy from many remote locations into where the customer load is. And so those costs are coming from new infrastructure. But the issue that the Clean Coalition is working on is that many of those renewables, the need can be met by using local energy, namely distributed generation, both in the wholesale field as well as exports from small-scale residential or commercial projects, the types of resources that we often refer to as non-participants. When those resources generate energy in excess of what that customer is using, it's exported onto the distribution grid and used by other ratepayers nearby. So in order to make sure that distributed generation resources are seeing the value of their unique contributions in avoiding transmission usage, then we need to change the way that TAC is metered. So this next graphic shows both how things work in California now and how we propose to change it. In PTO, or participating transmission owner utility service territories, these are the three major IOUs, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. The way that TAC is assessed is based on the customer meter. So if you have an industrial customer, they've got a meter measuring their energy take. Same with residential users. So there are these meters that are calculating the usage of each of these locations, and that number is aggregated up, and customers pay for transmission based on their customer meter. This is a problem when you're thinking about distributed generation resources that are not actually using the transmission system. So these kinds of resources generate electricity locally and are delivered to other customers locally. So that energy is delivered without actually relying on the transmission system. So this is in stark contrast to the way that things work elsewhere in California, such as non-participating transmission owners. So this is generally municipal utilities that are operating as metered subsystems. There's a small category of municipalities that work in this way, where they pay transmission access charges based on the transmission energy downflow from their distribution substations. So this is a more perfect measurement of how the transmission grid is actually being used in a more fair way to pay transmission charges, because those charges are attached only to energy that's actually coming off of the transmission grid. And again, this is in comparison to how it works in the major IOU territories, where transmission charges are allocated based on customer meters. So what we're proposing to do is to change the way that transmission costs are allocated from the customer energy downflow, basically the aggregating of all these customer meters, to the transmission energy downflow, the amount of energy that's actually coming off of the transmission grid. So we're proposing that transmission access charges that are associated with low voltage facilities would be allocated based on the transmission energy downflow at these distribution substations. For the cost of maintaining transmission infrastructure that is high voltage, the costs associated with the high voltage grid would be allocated based on the transmission energy downflow from these transmission substations that downconvert energy from the high voltage grid to the low voltage grid. So this would create a more perfect measurement of the user pay system by assuring that you're only paying transmission access charges for energy that's actually coming from each segment of the grid. This would align usage with payment, but it would also be very important in procurement decisions, and we'll cover that a little bit later, but just want to plant that seed in your mind right now. So here's another way to think of what changes with the original TAC fix. So before the TAC fix, transmission infrastructure is paid based on customer energy downflow in PTO utility service territories, and it's paid for differently for those municipal utilities or non-PTO utilities, which is based on transmission energy downflow. And what we're proposing to do is just to make it uniform across all utility service territories in California. So the high voltage transmission charges would be based on the high voltage to low voltage transmission energy downflow, and costs associated with the low voltage grid would be paid based on the customer energy downflow. One thing that this graphic highlights is that for costs associated with the low voltage transmission grid, those are segmented by different utilities. So for example, PG&E has a specific low voltage TAC rate that is different from Southern California Edison's TAC rate. And this is because these low voltage transmission systems are largely segmented by major IOU utility. However, it's slightly different for the high voltage TAC rate where everybody pays the same rate. So this is a little bit more detail on how it works now, and most of that structure would be retained. The only difference is how the usage of each of these systems is measured and how you pay. So we're proposing that instead of the customer meter being the determinant for how much you owe, it should be a measurement based on the transmission energy downflow, the energy that's actually coming off the grid. So this is a topic that has become more complicated because CAISO is currently weighing whether to expand its regional territory. So CAISO is currently just determining whether to include new areas that are currently operated by PacifiCorp and considering other regions in the future to possibly expand its territory and its balancing authority area. So this means that more territories would be included within CAISO. They're the California grid operators, and they're the ones who determine how the transmission access charges are allocated. So they're considering this expansion in the background of us trying to fix the market distortion on distributed generation. And so part of the question that they're going to be answering is how to allocate costs for new super high voltage transmission facilities between states. And the way that they're proposing it is to treat every new territory that's joining an expanded CAISO as a subregion within a larger new expanded region. So there are a number of issues that they're trying to sort through in order to make this happen. And some of these issues pertain to the transmission access charges distortion. So they're trying to figure out how to manage a governance structure, how to adjust the way that transmission access charges are allocated, and how to pay for any new infrastructure that's built to accommodate these new expanding areas. So this has created another layer of complication for our proposal, and we've extended our proposal to apply to an expanded CAISO. And so let me walk you through how that would work. So if you remember the graphic from a couple of slides ago that was just this set of boxes, our proposal would be to retain the way that that works for our original fix and to create a third category of transmission facilities that would have very limited criteria and only a few facilities would qualify. So for new super high voltage facilities that intertie between multiple subregions, there would be this new category of transmission access charges that would be allocated only on the transmission energy downflow coming off of those facilities. So this would ensure that the utilities that are using that new infrastructure are paying for that infrastructure in proportion to their use. So this is a way of extending our user pays model to account for a possibly expanded CAISO. This is how we think that our solution would apply in either case. If CAISO does not expand, then our original solution would solve the problem of the market distortion on DG. And if CAISO does decide to expand, this would be a way to ensure that our user pays model is extended to fit the new circumstances. And here's another way to conceptualize what we're talking about. So we would be creating this new third category of transmission facility, which would be only super high voltage facilities operating at or above 300 kilovolts that intertie between different subregions. So that would be in basically California and any other new territory where CAISO expands. If facilities meet those requirements, then the cost for those facilities would be eligible for region-wide cost expansion, cost allocation based on the transmission energy downflow off of those facilities. Oops, sorry. So the cost for this category would be assessed based on the transmission energy downflow here. The cost for the high voltage transmission systems would be based on this transmission energy downflow at these substations. And the cost for low voltage transmission would be based on the transmission energy downflow at the substations where energy is taken off the transmission grid altogether. So this is another way to think about what we're talking about here. So one thing that is very important for us to go through is to talk about exactly who benefits from what we're proposing. And there are a number of different stakeholder categories that would see huge benefits. The first and foremost beneficiary of our fix would be ratepayers. So ratepayers would be able to benefit through avoided transmission costs. So this is a slide that I showed you a few slides ago where we're expecting the TAC rate to grow very quickly. This is the business as usual case. This is the way that it's expected to grow. However, if you were to change the way that transmission access charges are allocated to the way that we're proposing, we would expect to see dramatically increased distributed generation resource deployment. So there would be much more local solar. And this would mean that some portion of energy demand that is occurring would be able to be met by those resources, which would free up capacity on the transmission grid and enable us to delay or avoid additional transmission investments. So there are a few different growth scenarios that we plotted out to explain this. So if we assume, remember this blue line is the business as usual case, where this is the way that the TAC rate is expected to grow. If there are 1.5 times as many DG resources deployed through our fix, the TAC rate's growth would be much slower. You would see that on the red line. See how it goes up at a slightly slower rate? That's because more rooftop solar means that there would be less need for more transmission infrastructure. This green line is a scenario where twice as much distributed generation is deployed as a result of our fix, and the purple line is a 3 times scenario. So all of this is to say that if you add on more DG resources, there's less need for additional transmission infrastructure, and everybody saves because of it. Because every new investment in transmission is split out among utilities and ratepayers through the transmission access charges, all ratepayers would be paying slightly less than they would expect to be paying under the business as usual case. So one of the other ways that this is going to show up is that the percentage of load that's served by DG resources will be dramatically higher. Under the business as usual case, 20 years from now, we're expecting to see only 11% of load met by DG resources. But if the DG resources are deployed in greater numbers through our fix, we would see dramatically higher percentages here, according to exactly how much additional DG resources we would see. We would expect to see somewhere between these green and purple lines, we think this is the most likely scenario, between 19.5% of new load being met by DG to 27.6% of load being met by DG. This is all a dramatically increased proportion of our load being met by rooftop solar than we're likely to see under the status quo. If the business as usual case carries forward, we're not going to see these kinds of numbers. And overall, this means that there would be huge savings in avoided transmission costs. So under each of these scenarios, you can see how much we're expecting ratepayers to save over the course of 20 years. We're talking about billions of dollars in avoided transmission investments. In comparison, the costs that we're expecting to see for actually implementing our solution would be about $20 million. And those costs are only associated with installing new meters at those substations. So for a $20 million investment, we can expect to see billions of dollars in transmission savings for ratepayers. So ratepayers are the number one beneficiary. Another key beneficiary that we would see are distributed generation developers. And the way that they would see a benefit through the tax fix is that their resources would be better and more fully valued if they were able to avoid transmission access charges. So LCBF, which you see in this chart, refers to the least cost best fit analysis. This is a kind of analysis that utilities sometimes use to just make their procurement decisions. If they have to build a new project to meet customer load, the least cost best fit analysis is one of their main tools. And so what this analysis does is it compares generation and delivery costs for each type of project. Transmission access charges are not included in this calculation because currently they're the same for everybody. If you're building a project within a specific utility service territory, it will face transmission access charges regardless, because currently all energy that's delivered to customers is treated the same way. This is assuming a participating transmission owner utility. So if you do this kind of comparison, central generation projects win out almost all the time against distributed generation projects because the cost of generating this type of electricity tends to be lower. You get economies of scale with large-scale central solar projects that are harder to find with DG projects. However, the big value that I mentioned is associated with DG projects is that they avoid the use of the transmission system. They help decrease the likelihood that we will need additional transmission resources in the future. So if we were to implement the tax fix that the Clean Coalition is pushing for, then we would see tax costs associated only with central generation projects and not included on DG projects. So this increases their value. It changes the outcome of least cost best fit analysis. And we would expect to see many more DG projects winning procurement decisions. Another beneficiary from our fix is NEM customers. So if the energy that is being exported from the resources that NEM customers use, basically the rooftop solar systems, then the value of that energy would be higher to utilities because it can meet local load while avoiding transmission charges. And one of the places that we have been able to see this already happening is from Alameda Municipal Power. They have come up with a NEM successor program that has increased the value of those energy exports. So this chart represents the previous value that Alameda's NEM customers were seeing for their energy exports. They were receiving about 5 cents per kilowatt hour for their energy exports. They recently changed their program to incorporate avoided transmission charges. Because Alameda doesn't pay transmission charges on local energy, they are able to credit their customers with avoided transmission charges because energy on the distribution grid saves utility money. And so this means that the NEM customers in Alameda see a much better return on their NEM investment through avoided transmission charges. So this is one way that NEM customers are better able to benefit. Another beneficiary of our tax fix would be load-serving entities or CCAs that have significant DG resources. So this is an old slide representing Marin Clean Energy's energy offerings, and they had different offerings to their customers depending on how much renewable energy those customers wanted and whether those customers wanted local energy. So here, this is all a comparison to PG&E's cost of energy, including delivery. So if you look at this, you notice that all the delivery charges for all of these service offerings are the same, despite the fact that local energy doesn't actually use the transmission system or is not delivered through the transmission system, and therefore is providing value to the grid and customers. So even though this is 100% locally produced energy, they are paying the same price. If you were to enact the Clean Coalition's tax fix, then you would see this energy being offered at a lower price because the cost of delivery would be lower. The cost of delivery would not include transmission access charges, and therefore MCE would be able to offer this 100% local energy at a slightly smaller price premium. So we calculated this out to see how the premium would change, and it would be about 2 cents cheaper. So there would still be a premium for local energy, but it would be slightly more cost effective than it had been before. So basically, CCAs would be able to give customers what they want at a slightly smaller price. So now we get to the topic of why this is an issue that needs to be solved before CAISO expands. So remember earlier in this presentation, I had discussed how CAISO is planning to expand its service territory to incorporate areas outside of California. Part of that expansion is going to include changes in the way that costs are allocated. So CAISO is currently hosting a stakeholder initiative to delineate how costs would be allocated for any new infrastructure after regionalization happens. So now that there are more territories involved, who has to pay for each new facility, transmission facility? And they have outlined a proposal that includes five separate categories for potential cost allocation, depending on whether it's an economic project, a reliability project, or a policy project, or a mix of all these. And comparing our proposal to that proposal, the Clean Coalition's fix is much more simple and straightforward than CAISO is currently suggesting. Our solution is based entirely on creating a separate category that is very narrow for any new super high voltage facilities, and those costs would be allocated based entirely on usage. The costs associated with any segment of the transmission grid would be based on usage. And so this is very straightforward. It's not subjective. It cannot be changed based on any change to the benefits analysis. All payment for the transmission grid is associated with usage under our proposal. So it's a comparatively simple fix. Another reason to adopt the TAC fix before regionalization is that our fix preserves California's policy priorities. California has spent a large amount of time and effort to build a renewable portfolio standard of 50% by 2050. We have also seen the legislature give direction to invest in and evaluate distributed generation resources. These are the priorities that California has put out and that the California Public Utilities Commission and the utilities and CAISO are all trying to meet. In order to make sure that distributed generation resources have a fair shot after expansion, we need to make sure that those resources are valued fairly and fully before expansion happens. After expansion, there's going to need to be a change in the governance structure to incorporate the viewpoints of new regions under the expanded ISO. And those regions are, by definition, going to be outside of California. So we can expect California's governance over transmission issues to be diluted. And being able to solve this problem before the governance structure changes ensures that DG resources have a fair shot after CAISO expands. After CAISO expansion, other stakeholders are not going to have any incentive to make sure that DG resources are fully priced. Knowing that California is the major market in an expanded ISO means that if Californians care about distributed generation resources, they need to care about it now before CAISO expansion happens. There's no reason to expect that an expanded CAISO leadership board would have the same reason to ensure that local resources are fully and fairly valued. So the next thing I wanted to go through is kind of a procedural history of how we got to this point and what the reasons for delay have been so far. So this is a long timeline showing how things have developed, and the items in blue are CAISO's actions and directions, and the boxes in purple are the Clean Coalition's efforts. So in 2015, the Clean Coalition worked with CAISO to identify the TAC market distortion on distributed generation resources, and that's how we identified this problem in the first place. So in November of that year, we testified to the CAISO Board of Governors about this issue and first brought it to their attention. In addition, we submitted comments in the TAC Options Initiative, that's the CAISO Expansion Initiative. CAISO responded by saying that these comments were better placed in the ESDR Phase 2 initiative. So we responded in that initiative and submitted comments. CAISO then responded by directing our comments towards a third stakeholder initiative called the Wholesale Billing Determinant Initiative. So we filed comments in that proceeding as well. Recently, CAISO has closed that initiative and has redirected our comments to a fourth stakeholder initiative. So the Clean Coalition is working very hard to cooperate with CAISO on this issue and to find common ground and to identify the best solution. In the background of this discussion back and forth with CAISO is the CAISO regionalization issue. So CAISO regionalization is moving forward, and CAISO is expected to introduce a bill on expansion in January. The California legislative session is scheduled to end in August, which is immediately before the new fourth stakeholder initiative is scheduled to end. So 2017 is the year where CAISO is planning to focus on regionalization and resolve those issues. And resolving the TAC market distortion on DG is scheduled to follow it. So this is a challenge for the Clean Coalition so far for all the reasons that we just went through about why it's important to solve this issue before CAISO expands. So this is bringing us to where we are today and is lending a very strong sense of urgency to why this issue needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. So this is where everybody listening on the webinar kind of comes in. These are the next steps on the issue and how we want you to get involved. The ways that you can help are by writing a letter to CAISO and to the governor stating why you think that this is an important issue that needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. And we have a template available that anybody is welcome to work from. If you want to see a copy of it, you can email me or Daryl Mahalik of the Dynamic Grid Council. You'll see his contact information on the next slide, as well as my own. Another way that you can help is by formally supporting the TAC campaign and offering us to use your logo on our TAC campaign supporters webpage. This is the page where we show the strong support that we've received already from partner organizations, and the longer that list is and the more influential those stakeholders are, the more likely our success is on this campaign. The last thing you can do is to recruit other stakeholders to support the TAC campaign. We are building up a strong alliance of other organizations, both environmental organizations, ratepayer organizations, industry players, as well as just concerned citizens. So if you are interested in working with us, please let us know. And if you know anybody else who should care about this issue, please let them know as well. So speaking of our stakeholder list, this is the list of organizations that have backed our original TAC fix. And this is the team that we've been working with so far and are very appreciative of and have had a very strong collaboration up to this point. And so we look forward to working with these partners and hopefully some new ones as well. So here is the contact information for me and Daryl Mahalik. He's been helping the Clean Coalition by coordinating many of our supporters and making sure that everybody is up to date on the latest happenings. But if you want another resource for that, you can go to the cleancoalition.org/TAC website and see the latest filings by the Clean Coalition, the latest comments, as well as graphics to help explain this issue. So with all of that, I guess we can now open it up to questions. So Josh, would you like to, has anyone asked any questions so far?
Yes, Katie, thank you very much for your presentation. That was great. Yeah, we do have some time, and we do have some questions that have come in. So if you're ready, I'm going to ask, I'm going to field some questions here from our chat box.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Does the proposed change in TAC essentially end what might have been viewed as a business subsidy of TAC that is charged to residential customers?
Yes, it definitely brings us much closer to ensuring that customers are paying for the transmission system in proportion to their actual use. So the way that things are operating right now can be thought of as a subsidy from utilities and customers who are investing in distributed generation resources like rooftop solar that is then going to centralized resources. So in other words, utilities and customers that have invested in rooftop solar are essentially subsidizing the transmission grid that doesn't really offer them any direct benefits. So yes, this would effectively end that subsidy by ensuring that you, being the ratepayer, are only paying for your fair share of the transmission grid. And we're saying that the fair share is how much you are using it, how much you're pulling energy off of that transmission grid. So there's still a very important role for central generation to play. However, we want to make sure that the costs associated with those resources are very clear to customers and to utilities so that those procurement decisions can be a little bit more transparent. So that when a utility is trying to decide between a central generation project and a distributed generation project, that the costs associated with transmission only attach to that centralized project. So projects that are able to avoid use of the transmission grid shouldn't be paying for the transmission grid. They're offering a service to other resources by freeing up transmission capacity, and we want to make sure that that value is captured. So yes, this would solve that subsidy, and it would offer other benefits as well. It would, like I said in a couple slides ago, it would also ensure that the TAC rate grows at a slightly slower rate, which means everybody saves. Even for the utilities that are entirely dependent on central resources, they would see a slower TAC rate growth than they are expecting to see right now. So even though it would be a change in the way that costs are currently allocated for the transmission system, everybody benefits, even those who are not investing in DG. So I hope that answers that question, but if it didn't, just feel free to follow up.
Great, thank you, Katie. We have a number more that have come in. Here's one for you. Under NEM, don't rooftop solar customers already avoid tax charges in IOU territories?
Yes, so the answer to that is a little complicated, but the best way to think about it is that they are avoiding transmission charges for their own consumption. When they're consuming energy behind the meter, they are not paying transmission charges on each kilowatt hour that they're consuming from their own system. The big difference where this comes in is for the energy that NEM customers are generating in excess of their consumption. So if their rooftop system is generating energy that they just can't use, it's exported back to the distribution system. And NEM customers will see a credit on their bill for their exports. However, if you were to change the way that that energy is valued so that it's clear that distributed generation is not subject to transmission access charges, then the value of that energy that they're exporting would be higher. So we would be expecting there to also be a better credit for that value, for that energy over the long run. And this would also be a good incentive for utilities to want to see more NEM customers or more small-scale local programs, local resources among the residents, because that energy would help the utility avoid transmission access charges. So the NEM customers are not paying transmission for their own consumption from their rooftop solar, but they could see an increase in their value for their exports. And in addition, the customers who are using those energy exports would be using exports that would not be subject to transmission charges. And so the idea is that this would create better value for the exports from those rooftop solar programs, and also provide a very real financial benefit to the utilities that they would then pass on to ratepayers.
Great, thank you, Katie. I have two questions, CAISO specific, from two different attendees, but they're definitely something that's brought up in our TAC campaign a lot that's worth re-asking. Why does CAISO want to expand? And the next question is, why is CAISO resisting the Clean Coalition fix? And I don't know if resisting is actually accurate, but I'll let you do the talking.
Yeah, sure. So CAISO is interested in expanding its territory uh, for a couple of reasons. One, it would expand the market for energy that is available to California, and there are certain economic efficiencies that attach when you have a larger market. And so the hope behind CAISO expansion is that there would be more renewables available coming from other states that would then be available or would be very competitive on the California market. So that's kind of the hope and the justification for CAISO expansion. A more cynical person might say that CAISO just wants a larger territory to have control over, but that's somewhat speculative. The real reason the reason that is the public justification for the expansion is improved economic efficiencies. So there would be more energy available and costs would potentially go down for generation. So that's why CAISO wants to expand. The issue is that we want to make sure that that expansion happens in the right way and doesn't let California get taken advantage of. And we also want to make sure that distributed generation resources are able to fairly compete. And part of that is making sure that they're not subject to transmission charges that they should not fairly be paying. And so that means that it's important for us to correct the value of those resources before expansion happens. The question about why CAISO is delaying this issue is also a question of perspective. The public reason for CAISO delaying is that they are committing so many staff hours to expansion that they don't have time to fully evaluate this issue. In previous stakeholder initiatives, groups that are opposed to the Clean Coalition's proposal have said that there needs to be a more in-depth review of the tax structure to see whether there is an alternative methodology to reach the same kind of solution for DG resources. So they want a comprehensive review of the tax structure, which we are expecting to be very, very complex discussion with a lot of different stakeholders, and I'm not personally really optimistic about being able to find consensus among all these stakeholders, but we're definitely going into it with an open mind, and we're very willing to engage on the substance of that discussion. So I guess to summarize, the reason that CAISO is delaying is that they are very, very fixated on CAISO expansion right now, and they want that to happen and be solved so that they can move on to other things. And the other reason that CAISO has been delaying this issue is that they're hearing from a lot of investor-owned utilities saying that they need a more careful and comprehensive look at the problem, which effectively means it's going to be pushed back to after expansion. So we are continuing to work with CAISO to see if there's any way to resolve this sooner rather than later. And we are also very closely monitoring the CAISO expansion issue, both at CAISO and in the state legislature. We want to make sure that this issue being the DG distortion, is resolved before expansion. And so CAISO continues to hear from us about why that needs to happen. We're pushing our issue forward, and if CAISO is still willing to engage, so are we. And to the extent that any delays continue, we're going to be investigating other avenues, basically looking at the state legislature and the state governor's office to see if we can find allies there. So this is another request to the supporters who are listening here. If you are interested in or have any sort of legislative contacts that you think would care about this issue, please follow up with me or Daryl. We're trying to attack this issue on all fronts, and that's why we need supporters to help us do it.
Thanks, Katie. And speaking of which, I just put your contact information back on the screen. All right, another question for you. In addition to NEM export, which you addressed, NEM customers pay a minimum bill. Where is TAC in the convoluted PG&E bill now separating generation and delivery?
So if you look on your PG&E bill, there's a section of costs that should say transmission and delivery, and TAC charges are mixed in there along with the costs associated with maintaining the distribution grid. That's your local energy grid that you would see outside of your house or outside of your business. So TAC charges are referred to, if you want to get really technical, TAC charges are the charges that utilities pay, and then those costs are passed on to customers in the form of transmission costs or transmission charges. So they're wrapped in with a couple other pieces of energy delivery costs, but that's where you would see it, is in the T&D portion of your bill.
Great,
They're
thank
not
you very
usually
much.
called out, sorry, they're not usually called out specifically as transmission access charges, but if you look for transmission costs on your bill, that's where you would see it.
Great, thank you very much. All right, another question for you. Given that investor-owned utilities earn profit from their value of their infrastructure, how can we make very transparent how biased they are against a tax fix?
We can do that in a couple of ways. I mean, it shows up in our comments to CAISO, and it shows up in our public testimony on this issue. Another way to make it clearer is to make that more of a focal point in our matters with CAISO. We're also open to other ideas on how to spread that message. I mean, the fact of the matter is that investor-owned utilities have a conflict of interest because when they invest in transmission infrastructure, they not only get repayment for those investments through CAISO, they're also guaranteed a very healthy rate of return on those investments in interest payments. So when they build a transmission facility, they're able to basically clip coupons from California ratepayers for the next 20, 50 years. So they have a very clear incentive to build more transmission, and ideally those decisions are supposed to be insulated from energy procurement decisions, but it's hard to perfectly verify how that works. So there's definitely incentive among participating transmission owners, like the 3 major IOUs, to continue investing in transmission. In terms of making more people aware of that, I think we just need to keep saying it. If there are any other suggestions on how to make it clear that that's what's going on behind the scenes, please let us know. We are always open to new ideas on how to spread this message. So I'm glad that whoever asked that question fully realizes that conflict of interest, and we need to make as many people aware of it as possible.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we still got a couple more minutes, so you okay for 2 more questions? I have another one here. All right, let's follow this closely because this is a little long, but I just want to get it all in. I view retail customers as the ultimate source of all revenue to cover utility and transmission costs. If the fix is implemented and TAC revenue requirements are removed as line items on customer bills and collected from load-serving entities who need to collect them from retail customers, don't the costs of TAC still get borne by the retail customers?
Say that one more time. Sorry,
Yeah,
I got the
no
first
problem.
half. I think I got lost in the second half.
Okay, I'll read the whole thing again. I view retail customers as the ultimate source of all revenue to cover utility and transmission costs.
Yes.
If the fix is implemented and TAC revenue requirements are removed as line items on customer bills and collected from load-serving entities who need to collect them from retail customers, don't the costs of TAC still get borne by the retail customers?
Yes, I think this question is getting a little bit more towards billing than decreasing the overall costs? The answer is that the customer would still pay, but the total cost would be lower. So I think that even under the rosiest view of how much distributed generation resources would be brought online, there's still going to be a very important role to play for centralized generation, even if we're just maintaining existing resources. So there will still be the cost of paying off existing infrastructure, but over the long term, we would see those costs go down because there wouldn't be the need for new transmission facilities. So in other words, the total cost for the transmission revenue requirement would be lower over time because you just wouldn't see new things. You would see the old projects being slowly paid off over the 20 or 50-year life of that project. And so the TAC rate would not grow. It would just kind of stay steady. Now that requires a significant amount of DG resources to the point that you're just maintaining existing infrastructure. We think that there's a pretty good chance that there will still be new transmission projects over time. That's why you see that TAC rate still going up over time, even under the strong growth scenarios. But there would just be so many fewer additional projects than we would be seeing under the business as usual case. So all this is to say that, yes, the customers would still pay for transmission charges because we expect that well, one, you have to pay off the existing infrastructure, but also there will always be a place for centralized generation. There are certain limits to the distribution grid and how much DG can be supported, and we are a long way from those limits. But if even at the highest penetration of DG, there will be a place for other resources as well. So there will continue to be transmission charges and transmission costs for those retail ratepayers, but through our fix, they would be much smaller than they would otherwise be.
Great, thank you, Katie. We have time for one more, and this deserves some clarification. This question is, to clarify, only SDG&E, SCE, and PG&E would be affected by the proposal. Local municipalities already follow the recommended Clean Coalition tax fix. That's a question.
Yeah, so yes, there is one caveat to that though. So in certain municipal utilities, they pay based on their transmission energy downflow, exactly like we're suggesting. The one thing that would change for those municipalities is that they, depending on where they interconnect with the CAISO system, they would pay transmission energy downflow TAC that are associated with each separate category. So for example, if that municipality connects at the low voltage substations, then they would pay low voltage TAC according to what they're taking off of that grid, and they would pay potentially less in high voltage TAC because they would only be paying for the high voltage energy that's coming off at the high voltage to low voltage interface. So currently, if a municipality is connected at the low voltage section, they're paying high voltage and low voltage TAC in accordance to how much they're taking off of that TED. Our proposal is a refinement of both the low voltage cost and the high voltage costs so that they would only be paying low voltage costs in proportion to what they're actually taking off of that grid. So we would expect things to change very slightly, but I think in almost all cases, they would be paying only for what they're using. So they would likely be seeing, I mean, I guess it depends very closely on how much energy they're taking from each section of the grid, but we would expect that to be a more careful accounting than how it currently works. They would only be paying their fair share of the low voltage TAC, and they would only be paying their fair share of the high voltage TAC.
Great, thank you. And there is one question from an attendee in Colorado was wondering if Colorado can be included in the future, but I would reword that question as is this a campaign that could potentially expand to other states in the future? Or is it something that is
We
on the
think,
radar?
yeah. So this particular issue is one that we've identified in California because of the way that the California transmission grid operator works. We've tried to identify whether this is an issue in other states, and identifying the answer to that question is really hard because you have to search through the tariff of each ISO, and sometimes the tariffs aren't specific on how they're metering transmission usage. And so we have only gotten two very complete answers on how this works in other ISOs. And so for in the New York ISO and at the ISO New England, they do a very slightly different approach by incorporating a demand component. But the important thing to note is that in both of those ISOs, the way that they meter usage is exactly how we're proposing. They meter usage based on the transmission energy downflow at the end of the transmission substations, rather than trying to aggregate the customer meters like we do in California PTO utility service territories. So we only have a small sample size of how this works in other states, but the answer is that of what we have seen, other states are doing this correctly. How this works in Colorado is an open question, and I think it would take a little bit of research to, maybe more than a little bit of research, it would take some research to identify how it works in Colorado. And we don't know the answer. It could be an issue there. It might not be. This is an issue that requires a little bit more investigation on each location outside of California. And if you
Great.
find out the answer to it, please let us know, because we are following this issue and we want to remove obstacles to DG resources throughout the country. And if this is an issue elsewhere, we would like to help.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And yes, and for the purpose of this webinar, we are focusing um, most of our efforts on the CAISO and the delay involved in their decision in our TAC campaign in California. So we can potentially have many more webinars in the future. So that takes us to the end of the hour, and thank you very much, Katie, for your presentation and for fielding 25 minutes worth of questions. That was great.
Thanks, George. Thanks for moderating.
No problem. And for those of you out there who are still online, please go to clean-coalition.org/our-work/TAC. We can also go to our homepage and sign up for our newsletter for updates on all of our initiatives, including TAC, sign up for our newsletter and other updates. Also feel free on our website to link through to our social media channels on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and of course YouTube, where this webinar will show up in a matter of days, and you'll all be getting an email about that with the link to a downloadable presentation, Katie's presentation, and a link to the video, which contains this webinar. So if you're interested in supporting the campaign, becoming one of many organizations, now we have 60 organizations in total. Email Daryl Mihalik at daryl@dynamicgridcouncil.com. His email is there on this, is right there on the screen. And we hope everybody has a great holiday season coming up, and we'll talk to you all next year. Thank you very much.